All right. Welcome to the CoTESOL Membership Lounge's AMA Monday with Julia Volkman, the founder and president of Maitri Learning. Julia, thank you so much for joining us today, all the way from Massachusetts, I believe.
It's great to be here. It's an honor. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited you could join us. I've watched some of your videos from the JALT, I think it was their PanSig event, and some other presentations you've made elsewhere. So we're really excited to have such a knowledgeable expert who has had such an interesting and diverse life, which isn't to say that it has ended. I'm sure you've got many more interesting and diverse things coming up in the future.
Oh.
But let's start with the past. What brought you to the world of education?
So I was in a professional career as medical director of a project director of a medical communications company in New York City. And my daughter was I was working remotely. And this was a while ago, before remote was common. And my daughter was 2 and just over 2. And I thought, oh, she's old enough now. She should go play with kids a couple days a week. And so the nearest preschool to my house was 2 blocks away, and it was a Montessori school. And so my daughter and I walked over there one day before it was in session. I think it was August. And we just thought we'd just take a peek and check it out. And sure enough, we met the head of a school who's now a dear friend of mine and who changed my life. And we walked in, and Devin, my daughter, was the head of the school, said hello to me. And then she said hello to my daughter, and she got down low, shook her hand, and she gave my daughter the tour. And I was just kind of in the background following along. And she treated my daughter with such reverence and respect. And my daughter responded so beautifully to this. Whereas, so often in our culture, the parents are talking and the kids are kind of down, aside. And not in this situation. The child was the focus. And she showed us around. And right then I was like, wow, this is for me. Something's going on here. And so, of course, I signed my daughter up, started to volunteer at the school. And then the next summer, I enrolled for a Montessori teacher training course because I thought this is what I want. It was such a different approach. And it really fit my interests and changed my whole career projection.
Wow. Now, prior to that, had you had any experience with teaching at all, or just experience as a student?
No. So as a project director of a medical communications company, I was writing and developing training programs for adults. And I was working with instructional designers. I was doing instructional design. I was getting edited. I was writing, editing, all of that. I was delivering workshops, delivering conference presentations, coaching others, and doing all of that work. So I had experience with adult corporate education and medical education. I had a good deal of experience with that, but not with starting at the beginning there with the little ones.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Was it different working with, I know it must have been different. How was it different working with children than with all of the adults you'd been working with?
Well, the main difference was with the Montessori approach, which doesn't, which looks at the human from a developmental perspective. So it doesn't look at, you and I are adults and we have different interests and needs and capacities than the child. Obviously, our brain is at a different developmental stage. In the Montessori approach, we look at humans as fully complete, wonderful humans who are basically good and complete, but they're creating themselves. And so the goal is to give them opportunities to create themselves skillfully and in a way that will benefit them in the future, to lay really strong foundation. So the whole approach was different because it takes things, the Montessori approach takes things and breaks them down to really isolate the stimuli that's being taught, to isolate a concept. And for young children, sometimes you're teaching language and you're singing and you're rhyming and you're doing a lot because language is developing at that age. But then in other times you're showing the materials and you're hardly using any words at all because you want to isolate the concept. So if you're teaching them how specifically to sew, for example, or how to peel a carrot, right? Practical living types of activities. You don't actually use a lot of words because you want their attention and their brain not to be overloaded with different cognitive inputs. You want them to be able to have all of their attention easily focused without competition on what it is you're teaching. So that was just completely different. In the adult workshopy, conference education type of world, it's very different. You follow I didn't have the neuroscience background at that point. And so you just follow this learning objectives and present it and then ask them on it. And you say, and then they say back, and, it was good. And that model is effective. It's not as effective, and it kind of breaks humans down into a one-dimensional view of the human. Whereas, of course, none of us are one-dimensional. We're dynamic. We're changing from moment to moment, let alone from age to age.
Oh, wow. So if you could, what tips would you give second language educators about how they can integrate the Montessori principles into language education?
Yeah, so there's a couple things, and this combines Montessori with neuroscience. So I later did my master's with focus on cognitive neuroscience, and that's why I'm helping to teach that the Neuroscience of Learning course at Harvard now. And that just brought everything I had learned so far in the Montessori world full circle. And the things that I learned studying cognitive neuroscience really supported the things I had learned studying Montessori, but it put it in a scientific framework. And one of the great things you learn in Montessori, which is completely supported by the research, is to isolate, like I mentioned, isolate what it is you are presenting, but to never forget the human in front of you. So you always start with a relationship. All learning begins with relationship. And so you and I have already been talking a little, and before you started recording, we had a little chat, and so I feel already a connection with you. I know a little something about you and your holidays and your family hazelnut coffee tradition. And it makes a difference, to have a human connection with people. It really does. And so before any learning really happens, you start with some kind of a human connection, and you acknowledge that there's a human in front of you, and all of that, everything that means, not just a tiny, all right, here's a student, I'm a teacher, here you're a student. You kind of don't hold on to that role so tightly, because we know as teachers, we know that we're always learning from our students, right?
Right.
So to break down in a little nutshell, I'm rambling, but to break down in a little nutshell, what that comes back to is to isolate the concept, but begin with relationship. And then when you're teaching, you want to follow the interest of the human you're working with at any developmental age. So with children, you can kind of watch them, you observe them, and you can see what they're drawn to. And with young children, it's almost like they're in a dark room, and it's like there's a flashlight like on their head, like one of those little headlights. And it's like all they can see is what they're focused on. And they're like, bing, they're little, zing over there. And that's all they want to do. And if you try to pull them away from that, they're like, no, right? They hate it. Well, that's their interest is driving their learning, right? And so with adults, it's actually very similar. And so we hear a lot when we're teaching English as a second language, we'll use little video clips or songs or something that the students are interested in to try and gain their attention. Because once their interest is roused, their attention will follow. So relationship, find their interests and follow their interests, and then use kind of a consistent and method that isolates the stimuli. So for example, to teach a vocabulary lesson, there's a very effective method that's used in the Montessori pedagogy, but it's actually based on work before Montessori. I think it was Seguin did it first, and it's called the 3-period lesson. And so you might have 3 different so you'll start with 3 or 4 objects that you're teaching. You could do it with action words later, but you kind of begin with objects. And you might say, okay, this is a phone. Phone, say phone. And then you would say,
Phone.
There you go. Okay, and then you'd say, I'll take off my ring. This is a ring. You say ring.
Ring.
Right? And then you'd say, these are glasses. Glasses.
Glasses.
Okay. And then you would have them all in front of you and you say, show me the glasses. And then they're going to point to the glasses, show me the ring, show me the phone, right? And you go, exactly. And then you mix them up. You say, close your eyes, and you mix them up. And then you say, now show me the ring, show me the phone, show me the glasses. Okay. And then and you do that many times. You might put them across the room, you know, and put them, walk to the other side of the room and say, bring me the phone. And then they bring it to you.
Mhm.
And then when they bring it to you, if they bring you the glasses, you say, you brought me the glasses, put it back so carefully and come and see me. So the next thing that this brings up is don't correct, represent. Instead of correcting, you want to represent, because the correction brings up an emotional response, even if it's subtle, and it creates some resistance, a sense of failure, a lack of self-confidence, a lot of different things. And so you don't want to correct, you want to represent. And instead, when someone does the wrong thing, you just, you know, if they bring you the phone and you asked for the glasses, you say, that's the phone. Can you go back, put it so carefully and come see me? And then you would go with them together, back up, and go to the first period again, and you'd name everything. This is the ring, this is the phone, these are the glasses. And then you drop it and you do it again the next day.
Oh, wow.
Because you don't want to embarrass the child. So you do little lessons, a little bit, and you find their balance. So you're doing this. So usually you'll do, adults kind of jump to the third period, which I haven't mentioned yet. So the first period is name the object. This is the second period is show me the. So you're giving them the vocabulary too. Right? Still you're in period 2, you're giving them the vocabulary. And then in period 3, this is the last thing you do, only when you're 100% sure that they actually know it. You'll say, what's this? Right? You'll say, what's this? And then they supply the vocabulary. So we as adults, we often dive right into that third period and we skip or we mix up period 1 and 2, right? And then we just do them once and then we jump into period 3. And that can create some challenges because most of the learning happens in period 2 when we supply the vocabulary, but the student gets to work with the vocabulary. So they're hearing it, getting reinforced, but they're interacting with it. And then some students need that a lot of period 2 work. Some students need like one period 2 lesson, and then they dive into period 3. It's really variable depending on the student. And from student to student, it's variable depending on the day.
Sure.
You know, if they come in and they're exhausted, right? Or they're stressed out, right? Then it's a harder day for them. So we have to acknowledge that variability. And so the goal is to encourage learning at the pace that just keeps challenge at the right level, right? Not too easy, not too hard, just enough challenge that they feel like they can do it, but they're just got to make a little effort to get there. Wow. So I think I did a bunch of things: relationship, interest, isolate the stimuli, right? And then the 3-period lesson where we're presenting, practice with the vocabulary, and only then do we test, right? And then don't correct, represent. So I brought up about 1 million things there, and those are all from the Montessori pedagogy and also from the mind-brain education neuroscience approach.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And that definitely, you know, jives well with everything that I've learned about how to teach and how to teach vocabulary, especially. Now, I wonder, is there any guidance as to about how many vocabulary words you should try to teach during that 3-period lesson?
Usually with young children, you'll do 3 or 4, but I found with adults, you do 3 or 4.
Okay. Oh, fantastic. That makes a lot of sense, definitely.
And then it really depends on the human. Sometimes you do 2, sometimes you do 6. It really depends on the human you're working with and the day that they're having, the moment that they're in. It can vary. It can really vary. So, and it doesn't matter. It's not, it's okay if it's 2 and it's okay if it's 6. And it's okay if you repeat it 3 days before you can move on. And it's okay if you repeat it once and you move on. That's just the variability of humans, and it's not a problem.
Right. Well, now that brings up another question that I think a lot of people watching this might wonder is what happens when you have a classroom of 30 different little humans all progressing at different paces? How can you kind of bring all those ideas together when you're juggling so many different students in a class?
Yeah, and so that's really the other thing that comes up with in the adult world, we would look at it as the flipped classroom model. And in the younger schooling world, we look at it more as the self-directed learning model, whereas we're not all going at the same pace because you will have 30 different students at any age with 30 different kind of learning paces. You know, they're all at different paces. And so when we, as adults, we get into traps and we trap our students when we say, all right, it's week 2, so we're moving on to chapter 2. Week 3, we're moving on to chapter 3. It doesn't matter, you know, and what always inevitably what happens if half the class is a little, you know, like a third of the class is not ready to move on, about a third of the class is ready to move on, and a third of the class was bored on day 2.
Right.
So, and they were ready to move on ahead of time. And so this requirement that everybody be on the same page just creates stress, right, for all of us, because it's just not a human reality. And trying to pretend that that's reality, it just causes trouble.
Right. So do you have any advice for how to get around that with the self-directed learning model?
Yeah, so if you're with adults and you're in a flipped classroom model, what you can do is you can, I mean, if everyone's familiar with the flipping concept, you really want to have your lessons so that they're doing their studying outside of class and inside of class is really more like conversation. You know, it's really talking about what's been studied. It's breaking up into groups. You know, in Zooms, you can do breakouts with their peers to talk about it. They can work with you in the breakouts, but it's really a relaxing kind of a fun environment where you're talking about what was studied. You're putting that into action in the live class, and then the work happens elsewhere. You can do the thing with a flipped model for the kind of the Zoom, the adult approach, is that people can study as much as they need to get to where they're hoping to go. You can also do, if you have a learning management system like Canvas, then you can set up little quizzes that they can take. And these can be little like 2-minute quizzes that you take 5 minutes at most, and they're graded, but they're not final. So you can retake the quiz as many times as you want to get a perfect score. And we do that in our neuroscience of learning course, and you'd be amazed at how many people retake it, and they can't get the perfect score. And so when they come to class, that's what we talk about. It's like that concept that was difficult is what we're really going into in class. They're like, well, why is it that way? And then after class, the quiz is still open. They can go back and get the perfect score. So it's not about grading them. It's about them showing themselves that they've mastered a concept. Some students want to get it to the perfect 100 on those little quizzes. Some students don't care. They're just like, yeah, I know it now, and I'm at the 80, and that's enough for me. And so it's really up to them where they're comfortable with, what they're comfortable with. But again, it's not, it's a non-judgmental kind of a supportive thing where the feedback is coming from themselves. It's kind of auto correction rather than the teacher telling them you're wrong, you know, which is difficult.
Oh, that's fantastic. So I'd love to come back to the neuroscience class you're teaching for the Harvard University Extension School. How did you get started on that? And how does that, well, we'll get into, I think, Maitri learning in a minute, but I'd love to know how you managed to balance all of these roles that you have. But first, how did you start teaching?
The balance there? Yeah. So I was a Montessori mentor teacher at a public school in Springfield, Massachusetts. And I had to get my master. I didn't have my master's yet. And I had to get my master's in order to keep my teaching certification. Massachusetts had just put in that requirement that you had to have a master's degree to be a certified public school teacher. And so I had to go back and get it. There were a couple programs that I could have done locally that were just like, you know, show up, follow the routine, get your master's. They sounded just like drudgery to me, and I couldn't do it. And so I had been interested for some time in the Mind Brain Education program at Harvard. And I had adopted my son a few years before from Kazakhstan. He had lived in an orphanage for the first year of his life. And most of us are familiar with the developmental challenges that presents a human to live in an orphanage environment. And so he came home with several developmental challenges. And I just wanted to fix it. I wanted to make sure I was doing everything in my ability to help and support him and to understand what was going on. And so I decided I don't care if it's a 2-hour drive because I'm in Western Massachusetts. I'm going to try. And I went and I tried and I got into the course. And so that's what got me interested. It just so happened that the neuroscience of learning course that I now help teach was the first course I took when I went back to get my master's at Harvard. And it was the first time that they had offered it. So I was really fortunate to be at the beginning of the course in that moment. And then the next semester I was asked to be a teaching fellow, and I've stayed off and on in that role ever since for some time. So that's where my interest. Most people I found out that have interest or research in a specific field like neuroscience of learning or something, they have someone in their life that has led them to it, often with medical research too.
That's really interesting. And then, so when did you decide to form your own business, Maitri Learning?
Oh, that was actually an accident. So while I was teaching in the classroom, and then while we were waiting for our adoption to go through, when you do international adoption, you kind of are on this, we'll call and then you'll get on a plane the next day, right?
Wow.
And so we were in that moment, and that moment lasted a year.
Oh
And
my
we knew it
gosh.
can last like that. And so I decided to take a break from classroom teaching because I didn't feel right leaving my students halfway through the year and being gone for 2 months. And then, having to be home for months with my new son. I just didn't, or new child, I didn't feel like that would be right. So I took a year off from teaching. And while I took that year off, I started making all these materials for when I might get back into the classroom. And because I was just so, I was like, oh, I have all this time. I'm just going to get ready and I'll be ready to go. And at the time, because I'd had this background in medical communications and being this project director, I knew how to do print publication. And so the way that I was making my materials was not at the level that most Montessori teachers were making their materials, just because they didn't have my background. So I showed them, a friend of mine saw them and he's like, you should send these into one of those Montessori catalog companies. And I'm like, really? He's like, yeah, send it in. So I sent them in. I ended up speaking with the president of the company, who's now, again, my dear friend. And she's like, well, send me everything you have. I want to see it. And I'm like, great. Okay, I'll send it right away. Get off the phone. I had like almost nothing made. Everything was in my head, right? And so I had only a couple things made. So I was awake for like, a week, like straight. I'm like, making all these materials. And I sent them in and they bought everything. And so like accidentally, I had a company. Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. So your company describes itself as being very green and eco-friendly and women-run and fair. Oh shoot, I've got hang on. I've got the exact quote right here. It's a green, eco-friendly, fair wage, right livelihood, woman-owned education business.
There you go.
How did that come about? And how did you decide those things were particularly interesting and important to you when you created your business?
I came about the business accidentally. And so I wasn't trying to do anything other than just kind of, I don't know, make these beautiful materials that Montessori teachers couldn't buy. You had to make them at that time. There was nobody making them well. And I thought, well, there's just no way I'm going to do this if I'm not going to do it well. It's got to be sustainable and, inspiring, joyful. It's got to be a good fit. In every way. And if it won't work in that model, well, then it won't work because I love teaching. I'll just go back to teaching. I love teaching. So it wasn't actually my intention to start this business. So it was kind of like a fun thing. And so I'm like, well, it's just for fun. I'm just going to do it exactly the way, without any compromises that I think it should be done, which is a different view than when you're like, okay, I got to make an income. And I had some savings that I used up completely during my little interlude of waiting for adoption. So I had a little flexibility to just, dabble and do it in a fun way.
That's great. And are those things of personal interest to you as well? Like, are you generally looking for ways to help improve, the environment and fight for equity in various forms?
Yeah, well, if you look at the human, it makes sense. All of those things they're not really optional. Like
Right.
when you're approaching humans as full, beings that are basically good and have needs and desires and interests, and with the view that when people are set in are offered the causes and conditions that lead to skillful living that brings happiness, then you want to create the causes and conditions. And of course, caring for the environment is, you have to do that if you want the causes and conditions to create happiness. That's
Right.
just part of it.
Oh, that's a really great way to look at it, I think. Very cool. Now, actually, I was curious too, as a language teacher, you have a lot of experience learning languages yourself. So let's see, I believe you are fluent in French and have studied German and a little bit self-taught in Russian, as I understand it. So
Yes. Yes.
how does your knowledge about learning influence your language learning yourself, or has it? Maybe your knowledge about education was actually inflected by your own language learning experiences. Like, how do those two relate?
That's a great question. When I first learned French, I did it in high school, and I just liked it. And then I went to France on an exchange in high school, and I just really enjoyed the experience of being in a different culture and trying to speak French and have it make sense. And after the second week of being in France, I dreamt in French. And like all of a sudden, speaking French was easy. Like the 2 weeks before that, I just had like this perpetual headache, where it's just like translation headache. And maybe some of us are familiar with that. You're just like, oh, what is it? What is it? What is it? And your brain is working all the time, all the time, all the time. And then all of a sudden that translation headache went away. And I could, just speak it, and I could just understand it, even though my vocabulary wasn't great and my vocabulary is still not great. It's very easy for me to switch in and out of French. And if I don't know a word, I can usually get around it to express myself or hear the rest of it to figure it out. And so that just made me really appreciate the experience of another language, especially because the expressions and the idioms that are used in different languages, they present such a different understanding of the value of the people in the culture. Like just the way people say things, you're like, oh, it never occurred to me to phrase it that way. And it's just kind of delicious. It makes you pause and really notice the cultural view of that language. And then so I decided to do German. I actually decided to do Polish in college, and I took one class in Polish, and they said, you really need German before you, because my grandmother, my babci's Polish, and so I wanted to learn that. And so I took one class in Polish. They said, you have to know German before you take this class. And I said, well, I don't know German. Oh, I'll just try it. And I took one class, and he's like, get out of my class, go take German. So I took German for a semester, and I enjoyed it. And then I went to Germany, and I got to practice that a little bit. And I never became fluent, but it was fun and enjoyable. And I've been back to Germany a couple of times, and I was able to do, enough, which was fun. But then for Kazakhstan, when I went to adopt my son, I definitely wanted to know some Russian. I did not want to feel completely isolated. I wanted to be able to communicate with him, to communicate with others, and to just have a sense of my place in such a different culture, dramatically different culture. And so I taught myself just basic survival Russian, which I have not held on to because I haven't practiced, which we all know you have to practice. So, but it was really wonderful. I took the Montessori approach, and I did make myself little cards. Like we have these on Matrix Learning makes these 3-part cards. And so one has just the picture, right? And then one has the word. And then there's a control card with the picture and the word. And so you use the picture to kind of teach yourself, just like I did with the 3-period lesson, the names of different things, foods, especially I did. And then you try to read the word and match it to the pictures. And then you can use this control card to check your own work. So I did a lot of that myself. I got a book on immersion to Russian to learn the Cyrillic alphabet, which isn't that difficult because it's phonetic. Once you learn the symbols, it's a phonetic language. And then I did some, Pimsleur tapes, and I couldn't find anyone locally to speak with. So I just had to do it pretty independently. But it was enough so that when I was in Kazakhstan, I didn't feel the culture's so different, and they don't love people who aren't Kazakh in Kazakhstan. At that moment that I was there, there was a lot of prejudice and divisiveness between the Kazakhs and the Russians. And apparently I look Belarus, and my Russian accent, what I would just call my terrible Russian accent, people perceived as a Belarusian accent. So
That's funny.
anyway, so there was animosity in the culture. And so it was really wonderful to me to have enough of a foundation in Russian to understand when people were around me talking, they were talking about the groceries or the bus, and not talking about this, foreign lady who was there.
Right. Oh, I definitely can understand that concern. It does feel like people are always talking about you if you can't speak the language, right? Especially when you stick out a bit.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. Yes.
So I wonder, can you think of any examples in French, German, or Russian, or did you ever go back and take Polish? Or did you just continue with German?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I didn't. I just did 1 semester of German. I did appreciate, though. I did enjoy it.
So among those 3 languages, or maybe even English, can you think of any of those expressions that you were talking about, the ones that just so beautifully represent the culture and show some kind of insights into the way people think about things?
It's funny that I knew you were going to ask me that. As soon as I said it, I'm like, oh, I should have examples. And I was having a hard time remembering some of them and what they are. But I bet you have some in Korean that you've noticed because you're living in Korea now. Do you speak other languages aside from Korean?
Well, I
English?
studied Spanish in high school, but that just means I can understand it, can't really speak it these days. But no, I was thinking about that when you mentioned it. And in Korean, they have an expression that means something like the wind envies the warmth, so that in the spring, just after cherry blossoms are coming out and the plum blossoms, it seems to be getting warm, and then suddenly there's a cold snap. And so that expression, gotsam chui, refers to that experience, basically, of the cold, or the wind envies the warmth. I might have that a little bit mixed up, but yeah, it was a really interesting idea, I thought.
How beautiful. And I know I've learned just the tiniest bit of Chinese, and it's, a friend of mine was explaining that in Chinese, there are so many different ways to say happy. There's like one of the ways is happy like a bird. And when you draw it, I think there's a bird or something in the symbol. I'm not sure, but I thought happy like a bird. How wonderful. Like we would never say that in English,
Right.
I guess you could say like twittery, or something like that, like chipper,
Right.
chipper.
That's
Would be
true.
like
That's
happy
true.
like a bird.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
interesting. So in all your
it is.
travels, in Kazakhstan and Germany, and you studied the French actually in Montreal, is that right?
I studied it in the US. I did an
Oh,
exchange to Paris, and then I
okay.
did my Montessori training in Montreal, which was a bilingual program.
So you've had a lot of experience in a lot of different countries. Can you think of any culture? I don't want to say culture shock, because I don't think that really captures what happens when we're in another culture. But any of those moments where something was just very interesting or unusual to you, and then maybe later you thought about it and you're like, oh yeah, that it makes a lot of sense that they do it that way.
Yeah.
A few moments where it was kind of revelatory to you about that culture.
Well, and I don't know how the language connects to it, unfortunately, but in Kazakhstan, babies don't wear diapers very long or at all. And instead, the mother and it is usually the mother, gets in tune with the child. And she knows when the child is going to need to go to the bathroom. And so she will be in tune with the child, and you'll see in the public rest areas, you'll just see the mother holding the babies up over the sinks.
Oh, wow.
Right, so they can pee right over the sink just like that, and then they're done. And I remember once I was in the car with a Kazakh mom and her baby, and he was about I don't know, 13 months old, I think, around there. And all of a sudden he had to go, and he kind of looked up at her, but she was busy chatting with me, and he looked and he looked and he looked, and then he went. She was like, ah, like that. She was like, ah, because she went on her, right? And so she's like, pull over, and held him out the window, right, of the car, so he could go right there.
Oh, wow.
And so there was this relationship, this immediate, and the car was stopped, they pulled over, but there was this relationship, this physical relationship between mother and child on those physical
Wow.
needs. And so there was a communication that was happening, without language, that was often happening, and they didn't even realize it was happening. They just knew, like they didn't know how closely the mother was observing the child and how closely the child was observing the mother, to develop this communication before the child could even speak.
Oh, that's amazing. How interesting. And so I wonder, after you adopted your son from Kazakhstan, were you able to create that kind of close relationship, or did you just use diapers?
I used diapers, but I did use cloth diapers, and we only used them for a few months.
Oh, wow.
And then went straight into using the small potty for him so that he could be independent with toileting. That's usually children are actually ready to be independent in toileting much earlier than we realize they are. I remember with my daughter, who's 26 now, didn't really know anything, the first time mom, I was just like, I can do everything. I'm super mom. I'll do everything for her, because I've just figured out how to do it right at the moment. This is the hardest thing when you're a new parent. You just figure out how to be a parent at the moment that your child needs you to kind of ease back on doing what you're like, now I know how to do it. And then you're supposed to ease back so that the child can start to take over, so it's kind of an interesting time there in the toddler, right? In the toddler years and then the early preschool years. So I was doing everything for my daughter, and right around 18 months, she was in cloth diapers. And then I'd always use cloth. And then she started to hold it, and then she would let it out all at once, right? And I thought, and the cloth diapers couldn't keep up. So I thought, ooh, I have to move to disposable. Instead of thinking, she's holding it.
Right.
She's ready to put it somewhere else. And it didn't occur to me, So anyway, so that's a total aside. But yeah, usually the children are ready earlier. And I knew that with my son, fortunately. So he was able to toilet train right around 20 months. He was able to start using his little potty independently.
Now, I wonder, I don't know if you would want to discuss this, but I'm curious, speaking of your son, how did you bring in your master's degree as you were raising him then, everything that you'd learned about the underpinnings of learning and the neurological basis?
Well, it's really interesting because I was in the Montessori approach, we're always observing our students because we want to find their interest and try to match the work that we assign, the activities that we assign to their interests and abilities. And so we become kind of keen scientific observers, which I think all teachers really start to do. We don't always realize we're doing it. And it's not always a formal practice. And if we formalize the practice and we could take notes on it, it's actually quite helpful. And so I started doing that more and more with my son. And then because of his developmental challenges, he had a bunch of neurodevelopment or developmental assessments he had to go through and a lot of that. And so I was just a keen witness for all of that to see how things happened, and discovered that, in my view, a lot of it was completely unnecessary and kind of medicalized him in a way that wasn't necessary, because the activities that we were already doing just naturally just really being present with your child and kind of engaging them in anything you can, like outside, walking, cooking together, cleaning together. That really was meeting the needs that he had. And you just, we lack a lot of confidence in that area right now because we don't want to make sure we're not missing anything. So it's a really fine balance to make sure we're doing everything we can, and at the same time, allowing time to just be human together.
Right. Well, actually, that leads brilliantly into the next area I really wanted to ask about, which is, how do you manage all of this? How do you manage the work life, personal life balance as a mom, as a business owner, as a teacher, and then just time for yourself?
Yeah, well, I think we all struggle with that. It's a
Mm,
real challenge. What has helped, and sometimes I'm more skillful at it than others, like all of us, right?
right.
And what has really helped me is to have a practice, kind of. So I'm a meditator, and so I have a practice of when I get up every morning, no matter what kind of a mood the morning arrives with, I get out of bed, I put on my yoga clothes, I do some yoga, some kind of core training or something, some
Mhm.
exercise to wake up the body. And then I make the coffee and then I meditate. And then, I can get dressed and clean, start the day and do whatever else is there. So having that morning practice really helps to bring and that's a really just for me, that's an independent practice that I do in the mornings.
Mm,
Later in the day, my family and I would really like to take walks together. And that's something that we can usually work in at some point most days. Even if it's raining or, yucky weather, we can usually get the right clothing to get outside, even if it's for a short walk. We like to take long walks and hikes, but we just get outside, at some point. And that seems to really, I don't know, even if it's a short time, that really rejuvenates us just to be together outside.
it's really nice. Um, do you have any advice
Yeah.
for somebody who is currently teaching but is thinking about maybe opening their own business, or maybe they make some really nice materials that they would like to monetize in some way? Any suggestions for
Yeah.
how they
First of
could
all,
possibly
don't take advice.
start?
My advice is think for yourself and really think about if your new business is going to be financially sustainable. Are you looking for it to be financially sustainable, or are you looking for it for joy? And if just kind of decide on what your view is, so that you can keep your balance and your perspective in the right place. A lot of times we have, when we first start out, we have exaggerated ideas about the income potential for
Mm,
our projects. And it's nice to temper that, with reality. So speak to people, reach out to people who are doing something similar and just ask and try to find out what the business view is like, so that you can understand if it's financially sustainable or if it's something that you'll do for joy, and maybe you'll break even rather than seed your retirement.
right. Oh, nice. Well, I know you say don't take advice, but one of the questions that I like to kind of conclude these interviews with is, what is the best advice you've ever gotten?
Question everything.
And how does that materialize in your life, or how has that served you well?
To when you think that something is a certain way, either because people have told you that or because you have a belief that it's that way, maintain curiosity about your view and of the views of others. When things seem solid,
Mm,
is usually when we get into trouble emotionally.
interesting.
And so if you're curious, have a curiosity about things that seem solid, and all of a sudden they maybe seem not so solid anymore, and things seem more workable than they may have felt before. So, and the one thing I definitely wanted to say is, in teaching in times of COVID with the pandemic, that our stress level, everybody's stress level is high, even when you're extremely fortunate and in the best of situations. This is a very stressful event. And so it's funny because we try not to be complainers. We try to be grateful and notice all the things that we have. And sometimes that can lead us not to acknowledge the kind of the weight of it all. The
Mm,
stress is difficult for the brain, and it makes learning particularly difficult in times of stress. And so with our students, with each other, with everyone, particularly with people who seem solidly in a way that's opposite from where you want to be, which is really challenging in the US these days. Maintain that curiosity and try to come at them with a view of compassion first. Always come at the human first, that relationship first. And then things generally soften and can open up from there. And then everything's possible, right?
right. Oh, that's really lovely. So we're almost out of time, and I wonder Is there anything that I didn't ask about, or any last thoughts that you would like to share with anybody watching this in the future?
I think stress is the biggest one, to just acknowledge in yourself and in others that stress is real, especially right now, and to just kind of lighten up, on what you think should be the minimum requirement for yourself
Mm,
and for your students. I mean, with Zoom and with all of this, all of us, so many of us thrown into completely remote models where we had been completely in person before. And it's like, it's becoming this job that used to be 40 hours a week. And now it's like 80 hours a week, because there's recording and editing and figuring out the technology, and then something stops working and you have to re-download it. And
right, right.
it's tremendous amount of work, and it can be very stressful. So I think the most important thing for all of us is to kind of acknowledge that and just like,
Mm.
oh yeah, we're not going to get everything done that we think we're going to get done, and try to recalibrate our expectations,
Mm.
so that they're calibrated for what's more realistic, and kind of, maybe question, what does done really mean, right? So that we can be a little more lighthearted.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Well, fantastic.
What
Thank you.
would you say?
Oh, gosh. I honestly don't know. I really like everything that you said just now, though. That's really lovely and inspiring, and I think it's something everybody really needs to hear. It's been such a stressful year for everyone, even those of us living in Korea. We're keeping an eye on other countries. A lot of us are from the United States, and we've been watching, the election and everything happening there. So I think definitely in a year as stressful as this, we really need to hear that, have compassion for each other and compassion for yourself. And I really like the idea of redefining what done is, because I think a lot of us really need to keep that in mind too, that maybe doesn't have to be as perfect this year as it usually
Yes.
does. That's really
Yes, I just spoke with a teacher yesterday
mm,
who was saying she was having such a challenge with her children, that her students just didn't seem to be settling down.
mm,
They were really just, seemed like there were so many behavior challenges that she hadn't seen before. And this is exactly what we spoke about. We were just like, well, it's just COVID. It's just stress, and
right,
it's okay. So find anything that interests them. It doesn't have to be the perfect, lesson or the perfect activity. Find anything that they can put their attention on,
mm,
and, that has the tiniest little nugget that you can witness a value. Find anything to interest them, and hold their attention, and go with that.
right, right. That sounds like really excellent advice. And I hope everyone watching this is as inspired as I am, honestly. So I think on that note, it's a good time to wrap it up. I don't want to keep you past our hour. So thank you so much for joining us, Julia Volkman. And for everybody who's watching this, thank you for joining us as well. We hope to see you at another AMA Monday in the future.
I'd love to. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye.